Hello, hello. Welcome back to Biblically Speaking. My name is Cassie Bolino, and I'm your host. I'm more than excited to have Dr. Tim Yonts back onto my podcast. Welcome back. I'm so excited to have you on here, and I don't think I gave you a proper bio introduction. So for those that didn't tune into our last episode talking about homosexuality, Dr. Tim Yonts, you grew up in Cincinnati, so that's where I grew up, and you have a Master of Divinity from Liberty University, a PhD in Theological Studies at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And you also are an adjunct professor at Liberty University. So that's where you're teaching now. You're teaching theology, worldview, apologetics, and ethics. And you also co-host a podcast called Psych Theo, which I love this podcast. You guys are bold and courageous on that. You guys cover some interesting topics, but
Yes, we
just
do.
like the biblical perspective on same-sex attraction, I'm excited today to talk to you about transgender issues and the biblical perspective on that as a Christian. So welcome back, Tim.
I'm glad to be back and looking forward to having this discussion. We're going to dive deep. This one's a bit more complicated, I think, than same-sex attraction, but it's related. So let's get into it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm coming from this very egocentric place. I'm a Christian. Transgenderism is a huge topic. So as a Christian, how do we respond? How do we respond if I'm having thoughts? I think that this is where that relative concern comes into play, but it also just feels like everything we see online, always aggressive. It's always from a place of who's going to win, who's right, somebody's better than the other person. And that's not really what I want to do on this conversation. I just really want to understand, as a Christian, what does the Bible say about it? Because my standard for living aligns with what the Word of God says. And so I'm just going to default to that. And again, that's kind of where we start splitting from what is of this world and what is set apart. But this is meant to be educational. And I guess I'm starting, with that sensitivity and trigger warning at the start of this podcast that I assume that we're not going to be talking about child-friendly topics. And we're definitely going to be talking about some more sexual surrounding topics. And you might be a little triggered if this is something that is sensitive to you and your ears or those around you. So for the purposes of education, thank you, Tim, for leading the discussion.
All right. Yeah, I'm I'm ready to get into it. Yeah, there are some issues in the transgender subject, especially when we get into history. There might be some graphic descriptions, like we'll curb that language, but there's some things we got to talk about that the scriptures either allude to or were aware of, the authors of scripture were aware of in their day that was going on, and how that relates to today. So yeah.
Cool. Well, just starting off with you, what is your experience with this topic? Have you taught on it? Have you just studied it? Or what's your experience with just, all the depths that we're going to go into?
Well, I'm an ethicist by training. So as I said in the previous episode, we ethicists, we kind of have to be generalists in a lot of different fields and then try to integrate them all together. So our job, at least as a Christian ethicist, is to help Christians think ethically or morally about different issues, all kinds of different issues. So with this topic, it's related, like all the LGBT issues, they're all related together. So my experience with it has been teaching at the undergrad level, introducing students to what it is so that they know the terms, they know the lines of debate, and what a biblical approach would be. And then also not just training them on what the Bible says, but also training them on natural law type arguments, like not unbiblical arguments, but non-biblical, where you don't necessarily need the Bible to make an argument like this. Because sometimes if you're talking to someone if they don't believe the Bible, just pointing stuff out in the Bible is going to be of no effect on them.
That's true.
But you could use arguments that are what I call non-atheological or non-religious to persuade them. So I train students in that too. So
that makes sense. I feel like this topic is pretty secular as a whole, and it really kind of comes down to, how I feel about my identity and what I want to decide with my own bodily autonomy. So
Totally.
How does God fit into this? How is this even like moral issues fit into this? It seems like a very individualistic perspective, but again, we're here to learn about the Bible. So what does that old book say about it?
Yeah. It actually says a lot, surprisingly.
Interesting. I don't think I've ever heard in all my years of church going and Bible study, I've never heard of a verse that references transgender. So is it fair to say that, just like from an origin standpoint of transgender issues? Was it non-existent during, ancient Near East culture? Was it well known? I know we talked a lot about like Greco-Roman culture and how open that was when like Paul was writing, but could we just like kind of start at the origin? Like, when did this pop up? Where did it pop up? And where did
Okay.
the influence start?
Okay, so the modern movement of transgenderism is different than historically how we've kind of understood the gender bending, crossing kind of behavior.
Oh,
I
okay.
say that because transgenderism as a movement really springs out of modern feminist movements. And if I would encourage people to go back and listen to on the Psych Theo podcast, our very first episode is called "There Are Only Two Genders. Here's Why," and we give a brief overview of the history of the feminist movement. And really, transgenderism is like the fourth wave of the feminist movement, and it's really kind of the
What?
culmination of a feminist movement, and it's become quite anti-feminist in a sense because now third wave feminists are at odds with the transgender movement because they see its undoing. Like J.K. Rowling, many people know who she is, the author of Harry Potter. She's what one might consider to be a TERF, and that's called a trans exclusionary radical feminist. So she is, you could put her in the camp of a third wave feminist, but she is very much opposed to not people having the ability to modify themselves, but she's opposed to the transgender movement being a part of the feminist movement and disrupting women's sports and other things like that. So
So a
yeah.
transgender exclusionary radical feminist is essentially like, oh, it sounds like to me, and again, like I'm just first time hearing about this, is someone who just like boldly defends the feminine, rather than like makes it open for interpretation. Like she's saying strongly in her lane is that it's not able to be up for debate. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. So they would say that the feminist movement is exclusively for women, for biological women, to
Got it. Okay.
challenge gender roles and to rewrite gender roles in society and things
Got
like
it.
that. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So they see transgenderism as undoing a lot of their progress.
I see, because now it's
Hmm.
like open up to interpretation rather
Yeah.
than, kind of highlighting the role of the feminine and giving her equity and equality.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
see.
But the modern movement of transgenderism has sprung from uh, 20th century sex studies. I can't remember the gentleman's name right now, but there was a few psychologists and um, researchers who had kind of picked up on this idea that some people have this experience of being a different gender than what their biological sex is, and now we call that gender dysphoria.
Interesting.
This was early 20th century. They were studying transvestites. They were studying people who were born with hermaphrodism, and some other what we call um, um, oh man, I am blanking on the term. It's deep in my notes here, and I can't pull it up. It's called DSD. So it's a sex disorder when people are, like hermaphrodism would be one of those. So they're studying these types of people, but they are picking up on this idea that maybe gender, which is the outward expression, the social expression of something, is different than sex. So they start to make this distinction between sex and gender, and that's really at the root
Yeah.
of what we refer to today as transgender ideology, is that sex and gender are distinct and are not that they're unrelated, but that one that is sex, biological sex, should not be determinative of the other.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's the key premise of transgenderism. So if someone's getting into this topic, there's a few terms then that they need to be aware of. One is sex, what that means. Sex would be like the biology, like you're either born with XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes. So that's a chromosomal makeup of someone, and that determines your sex. You're either biological male or female. Then there's your anatomical features, the things that you're born with that would show what biological sex you are. But then gender, they would define as the inner subjectivity, that psychological understanding of masculine, feminine, or something in between, or something totally different. So
It's
they're
interesting. I feel like the
yeah.
sex or the XY chromosome and like your genitals, wouldn't those be like the same? Or I don't understand how those could even be distinct from one another.
So they wouldn't distinguish between your genetics and your anatomy. But they would say that, so your genetic markers really in the development process will ultimately determine the sex distinctions of your anatomy, your genitals, and things like that. Okay, so it's your chromosomes will drive your body toward that way. If the body naturally develops without um, malformities or abnormalities or anything like that, so by and large, most people XX chromosome, it's going to develop into a healthy girl, XY healthy boy. Okay, what they distinguish between is gender is the what they would call the social construct, or the social norms and rules and customs of how boys should act and how girls should act and how they should dress and behave and the roles that they take in society. So someone who's experiencing gender dysphoria, which is a real phenomenon, is they are experiencing this disconnection between their psychological understanding of masculine or feminine and the body that they are born with. So if they're born anatomically, biologically male, but they quote unquote feel like a woman, then they might be experiencing gender dysphoria. And that's a real state. It's not everyone who claims that is faking it or lying or anything like that. There's people who really struggle with this. But that's that phenomenon. And the transgender movement comes sort of out of that. What the transgender ideology says is that someone who is experiencing gender dysphoria, the proper treatment for them is to transition into the other gender. I think a Christian approach, a biblical approach, is to try to treat the gender dysphoria, the experience of that, not to permanently alter the body in such a way that they would basically encouraging them to transition. So there's a difference in the solution.
Right. And I understand, well, I guess I don't understand because I'm not them, but having some sort of disorder or even like body dysmorphia, would that kind of be like relative, not like same, but different as far as like thinking you're huge when you're anorexic, of like just not being able to comprehend or see the rational difference here, that like you would treat body dysmorphia, you would treat anorexia. You wouldn't let them be like, okay, you are now skinny and you're just going to be, 10 pounds or whatever. But it's one of those topics that I have no insight into. So I'm trying to understand it. But
you're hitting on something. We might be jumping ahead of ourselves, but you're hitting on something that I think most people intuitively pick up on, and that's the logical implications of transgender ideology. And that is, if my identity is ultimately rooted in a subjective state, that is like something in my mind, if my identity is rooted in that and it's separated from my biology, then who's to say that I can't redefine myself in all kinds of ways,
right. And I think it's
including that body dysmorphic movement, which now is called trans-ableist.
And I'm sure that if there is a trans person listening to this, they're probably extremely offended that it's not something subjective. This is who they are. This is their identity. Yeah. How is this different? Like, how does it now become an identity when it's something where you're right. I think from a logical perspective, if I don't connect to the genitals I was born with, that seems like something you could treat similar to anorexia. Same, but different again. But the identity aspect is what makes it different. It makes it more threatening to want to change. Does that make sense?
Well, if someone has been convinced to believe that their root identity, their fundamental essence of who they are, is the experience, the gender experience that they have in their mind, then yeah, it's going to be really, really hard for them to let that go. We didn't get into this in the previous episode on homosexuality in the Bible, on the problem of identity, but many people, and this goes for anything, if we root our identity in our sexuality, like either our sexual orientation or sexual expression or something like that, like in the Christian worldview, we would say that's not where your identity is ultimately rooted anyways. So there's a problem where if someone is rooting their identity, their fundamental of who they are as a person in that, we're already getting off to a rough start.
Because your identity's in Christ.
Yeah, well, yeah, all right, yeah, in the Christian worldview, yeah, but what that means is that we are created beings. We're loved by God, and God is the one who actually gets to define what we are and who we are and how we live.
Oh, so it's almost like idolatry of the self by saying, no, I'll decide?
Well, in a sense, I wouldn't say that everyone who experiences gender dysmorphia is like, in idolatry. I don't want to go that far. But the transgender movement or the LGBT movement, I have no problem saying that it is a form of idolatry, just like lots of other things would be forms of idolatry in our culture. Politics, political parties can be idolatry, or certain movements in our culture. A sports team, you can make that into your idolatry.
Taylor Swift.
Yeah, Swifties. I'm gonna get in trouble now.
I know they're
Um,
hearing us.
yeah. So anything like that, when it is elevated to the point that it drives and confers meaning and purpose to your life, and it's not God, then it has taken the place of God, and therefore it's idolatry.
Okay, but not with transgender. There, you don't see the same thing happening there.
Well, not with people who are like experiencing gender dysphoria. I don't think the experience of that is idolatry. I do think the movement is idolatrous.
Okay,
Like
so
the movement of we have to, like, it's a movement of sexual liberation. Again, think of like radical feminism. It's a movement of sexual liberation, of throwing off the patriarchy, of throwing off all norms and customs in society, and dismantling systems of power. Like all that kind of stuff is wrapped up in an idolatry because it's giving new
interesting.
meaning and purpose to someone's life that's not God.
Interesting. Okay, so you keep referencing kind of gender dysmorphia as different than transgender. Is it two separate things?
Dysphoria, yeah,
Dysphoria,
yeah.
sorry.
So I could talk about that. Yeah, gender dysphoria is it's a psychological state where someone feels distress. And they feel this incongruence between their biological sex and their psychological experience of gender. So that's gender dysphoria. Transgenderism or transgender. Let's say a transgender is someone whose gender identity does not conform to their biological sex. So it's someone who might be experiencing gender dysphoria, and then they decide, I'm going to have a have a sex transition and gender transition surgery,
Okay,
something like that. Or I'm going, at the very least, I'm going to present myself as the other gender. I may not go through with the transition surgeries, but I may put on the outward attire and start acting like the other gender. Or I might just deny altogether that there's what's called a gender binary. That is the belief that there's only two genders, male and or men and women. So some people
got it.
say there's
So
no
it's almost
gender
the next
binary.
step. It's
Yeah,
just the next step of the
yeah,
dysphoria.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. You were, so just to go back in history, because I love a history lesson, but was
So,
there,
so
did
really,
this
really
occur
early 20th century. Yeah,
early 20th century? Did
yeah,
this, I don't know, it feels a little ignorant to say that's when it started. I'm sure that there are occurrences of
yeah,
transgender or gender dysphoria before, you know.
I'm sure there were. In fact, we can find examples all throughout history of someone who might be like uh sex disorders, like developmental sex disorders. That's the word I was looking for earlier. DSDs, developmental sex disorders, are something that occurs naturally, and that it's a something that goes wrong in the developmental process. And so someone could be born intersex or hermaphroditical, or have something like Klinefelter's syndrome, or something like all these other kind of disorders that we've identified. There's It's perfectly reasonable to think that people throughout history have been born with those, but they're exceedingly rare. Um, just to
I
put
guess you
this in
talked
perspective,
about all those like their disorders, but they were never identities.
again, an identity is I am this way. When someone says I am this, that's what they're saying, is that's my identity. I wouldn't call someone like who is born with one of those disorders like that's their identity, because for a long time, the discussion about what to do with people who are born with these disorders is real question is, how do we bring them into conformity with their chromosomal, like their genetic makeup. So someone who is born intersex, here's a good example: the Olympics just this year, the boxer, the female who won gold, the person who won gold in the female boxing, she is a biological male. She has XY chromosomes. So there's this whole debate, and there's a lot of confusion around this topic, because her defenders will say, well, no, she is a woman. She's been a woman her whole life. I think, and I think that's because she's born biological male, but she's born intersex, which is uh, th- like the genitals don't quite form clearly, like they're sort of mixed up, and the doctor then has to make a decision. the parents have to make a decision. In what way are we going to structure this person and raise them? How are you going to raise them, a boy or a girl? And it's
I
a
see.
tough decision to make. So that's why the challenge, the controversy with this boxer is that having XY chromosomes, she has all the genetic markers of a man, including like elevated testosterone and other things that give her an advantage, like an advantage as a man would walking into female boxing. And I'm probably going to get canceled for for saying these things, but that was what the controversy was swirling about, and that's
I
why she
see.
was disqualified from the, I think the what some federation, boxing federation before the Olympics said you can't box in women's sports because of these things, in the Olympics letter. And I'm saying
Yeah,
her just kind of loosely because it helps, but I would say
right.
she's a biological man.
I think
Yeah.
anybody can understand that a male and a female in a boxing ring, it's very clear that the male's going to win. So if a woman who is, identifying as a woman and has lived her whole life as a woman because of that intersex decision at her child's birth, I think the way that she lives her life makes sense. But I also think, yes, you have significantly more of like certain hormones and muscle build than
Yep.
I'll ever have
Bone
access to.
density, everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, both are true. I mean, yeah, she was raised as a woman her whole life because of a decision at birth, but you did have access to different things than my female body ever would.
Yeah. Yeah. It would, I mean, it would be like, it'd be akin to, um, someone taking like THC their whole life. Not THC, that's marijuana. uh,
Human growth
HGH,
hormone.
yeah,
Yeah.
HGH, yeah.
It's like, where are we going?
I'm definitely gonna get canceled now.
We're way too tired for this podcast
Yeah,
right
yeah, yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
One of the things that I feel like comes up a lot, especially now today, is, how do you reconcile with God made me this way? I genuinely feel in my heart that he misgendered me. So how, like, where am I supposed to land in my relationship with God, who is supposed to know me, who's supposed to love me, supposed to care for me, but I genuinely feel like he misgendered me. Like, where does that go?
yeah. So there's a lot of scientific research and debate about what causes gender dysphoria. To date, there's no study that has proven, oh, it's this genetic marker, or it's this hormonal imbalance, or something that is actually causing this, and it's a natural thing for this person, and therefore, this is a good thing to transition them. Because a lot of these studies, there's correlations, but there's nothing that shows a causative or causation between like my something that happened biologically, and that's what's driving this identity in me now. So that's one piece. Is like it's similar to the argument of, are people born gay? The question, are people born gay? Like, why? Why would I not? Why could I not live this way? I'm born this way. So the question is, are transgender people simply born transgender or with gender dysphoria, and that's all we can say about it? Well, the answer is no. It's not as simple as that. But let's recognize something, that the fall does affect us in lots of different ways. And we live in a fallen, broken world. And sometimes, just like we can see these uh, disorders in sexual development, developmental sexual disorders, as they're called, sometimes those happen. They're rare, but they do happen. And it's tragic when they do happen. We can recognize that sometimes it's psychological, like the body may be intact, but something happened in the brain. And the point there is not to root the identity, a person's identity, in what has happened in the head, but to look at the given natural reality of the person. They're born chromosomal male. They're anatomically male. So the body is actually telling us something about what ought to be. And so one of the arguments that the Ryan T. Anderson's book goes into is that what's happened in the transgender movement is that it's actually reversing our understanding of medicine and how we ought to treat someone. Because if we say, well, if we started out, for traditionally we've said the body is what should direct our treatment, but now they've reversed and said no, the mind or the subjective state that can't be observed by anyone is the thing that directs treatment. So
Whoa.
when you get into the Hippocratic oath of, my first responsibility as a doctor is to do no harm, but if I'm permanently altering the body, which is intact by itself, like it's functioning properly, and it's an organism that is, all the parts are working properly, and I'm taking this person's subjective state or feeling and using that as the basis for my treatment, well, that seems like a slippery slope that can cause all kinds of problem. So anyway, I'm going down a road. It's a little bit different of an answer, but why would God let me be born this way? I think the problem, like, we need to recognize is that the fall affects us all and affects us all in lots of different ways. But God calls us to live as men and women
despite the fall.
Yeah, like the fall pushes on our natures as human beings, and God calls us to holiness. I mean, we're born with. I'm born with a proclivity to seek revenge on people if they do me wrong. Does that mean it's right?
That's a good point.
Yeah. So we can be born with I can be born with a predisposition to alcoholism. Does that mean God doesn't love me because of that? No. God recognizes those struggles, but he still calls us to holiness and he calls us back to him. Okay, but you asked about the Bible, and I think you want to go deeper into history. Am I right?
Yeah, I want to talk about the Bible if you haven't caught on.
So let's transport way back into ancient history, shall we?
Yes.
So I admit I'm not an authority when it comes to things like Native American, Two-Spirit stuff, because oftentimes the transgender groups will point to, like, well, look, there's Two-Spirit people in animistic religions and Native American religion. We can see that it's usually a shaman or something like that lived as both genders and sort of channeled both quote unquote spirits in the spirit world. Which, that's a whole nother topic we could get into sometime, is religions like that. But I'm not an authority on that piece. So I'll just kind of punt to someone who probably is better at that. I actually have some books I can recommend at the end of the episode for people if they want to check stuff out. But let's go all the way back. I said the Bible has a lot to say about this issue, even though the word transgender doesn't show up, or gender dysphoria, or any of the medical modern terms that we use, okay? Similarly, the word abortion doesn't occur in the Bible, but the Bible has a lot to say about life, especially unborn life. So there's a lot of things that the Bible doesn't address directly, like a modern issue, but there's principles that we can see in Scripture that definitely apply. And then there's some things that are tucked away that we should be aware of that may help us, like, cultural things. Okay, so let's get into this. The point I made in the homosexuality episode, I'll make here again. We need to first get a big picture of what the Bible says about gender, just like we need to get a big picture of what the Bible says about sex and what its place in the heterosexual marriage union. Well, we need to look at the broad picture, what the Bible says about gender, the big picture. And then that's our positive case. And then we can address some of the, what I call a negative case, like the prohibitions and things that say this is wrong. But what the Bible says is good. It overwhelmingly, universally describes the genders as man and woman. And it does that from beginning to end. So right off the bat, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, you see the creation narratives. God creates man and woman, male and female. And he doesn't just create them that way. They have roles to play that are based on their genders. So God creates woman, and he says, hey, Adam, I've made a helper for you, someone who is suitable for you. When they fall, let me back up. So then he tells them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So there's definitely a role to play for both men and women in filling the earth and being fruitful and multiplying. You need the complementary gender roles to do that. You can't do, as the old quip, the old joke says, in the evangelical world, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Okay. So I don't know if you've ever heard that or not, but
I've heard it. But I do think that a lot of people, I mean, I want you to keep going, so I'm not going to sidetrack too much. I'm already hearing kind of the conversations that I were brought up with of like, well, that's kind of dated. Like, we've got enough people, don't you think? Like, I don't think we need to abide by that old commandment because, like, that was when the earth was empty. So what's the point? Like, it shouldn't apply. Wouldn't it be a non sequitur? Or do you feel like that is what the word of God says? So if we're going to throw out one verse, why, like, you got to stay with all of them. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, our natures haven't changed. Like, we're still human beings created in the image of God. So again, if I'm talking to Christians, I would say Genesis 1 and 2 say that we are in the image of God. Do you think that's dated?
Okay.
If they say no, then I say, why not? Because, well, it's still our same nature. We're still created man and woman, and that is consistent throughout history. And so our genetic and sex differences actually clue us into how we need to relate to one another and to God. Okay. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't go out and get married and have children, that you're therefore sinning. I mean, that there's verses in the New Testament that talk about being single or being married, and both can serve the Lord. So but the fundamental genetic sex distinctions and how we relate to one another, that hasn't changed. And I would say no society in the history of the earth can function unless they recognize those sex differences and accommodate them. Now, each society does that a little different, but each society has done that. When a society tries not to do that, we get chaos.
They try not to reproduce?
Well, no, when they begin to blur the sex distinctions or deny them altogether and redefine them as something totally different, as we see today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good answer. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. So even the curse, there's effects on men and women. Men, because of their physicality and their responsibility to provide and to work and to defend, God says you're going to go out into the field and you're going to have to work hard. And the ground is not going to yield the fruit that it once did. So the curse on man has to do with his labor and his work, which relates to his physicality and his ability to provide. So that's going to be much harder for him. A curse on women, her pain in childbearing is going to be much worse. And if we're relating to the feminist movement, God says, and your desire is going to be for your husband, but he's going to rule over you. And that the verse desire there means the desire to control.
Oh.
So yeah, I mean, there's some debate about that, but I think that's a pretty strong argument that that's what that means. Because in the next chapter, Cain, when God rejects Cain's sacrifice, God says, behold, Cain, sin crouches at the door and its desire is for you. It's the same word. So sin is crouching at Cain's door and it desires to have its way with you, Cain. So it's the same word there.
Interesting. Yeah, I would have attributed desire to like more like a sexual like attraction type of thing.
Yeah, some people do because the same word pops up in Song of Solomon. But that, again, that's a different context. That's poetry. That's centuries and centuries later. What you have is in the immediate next chapter, you have this like the same. You have a similar concept at play with the same word. Because he says, look, this is. I mean, does it sound like much of a curse if you like, hey, you guys are really going to want to have sex? Like that doesn't sound like a curse. That's what I take that from my theology professor. It's like that wouldn't be a curse.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's
so he says your desire is going to be for him, but he will rule over you. So the contrast, that's what clues us in. So anyway, so like even in the curse on human beings, the consequences for sin relate to our genders in some way. So we can't really escape that.
Okay, I'm following.
Okay? Yeah. But we can go even further. I mean, we'll come back to some of the Old Testament law stuff. Let's jump all the way into the New Testament. We see gender distinctions in Jesus, how he teaches on marriage. He goes all the way back to the beginning. The Jews are asking him about divorce, and he says, "Hey, from the beginning, it wasn't so. But God created them male and female, and the husband will leave his father and his mother, and he will cleave to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh." So the two of them being complementary to one another, that clues us in how human beings, how men and women are to relate to one another. Similarly, there's that marriage complementarianism is a model for the church in the bride of Christ, as the bride of Christ. So Paul talks about this in Ephesians 5. He says the relationship between a husband and wife is this mystery that models Christ and his church. So there again, you see this distinction, this gender, if you'll forgive the term, gender binary between men and women, this distinction and the roles that they play. Paul says, husbands, love your wives and give yourself for them. Wives, submit to your husbands. And then he goes on and gives a lot of other, different responsibilities for each. So, and that's just one passage. We have 1 Peter 3, Colossians 3, are a couple others. 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says that the relationship between man and woman, the sexual relationship is important between them because you don't want to fall into sexual immorality. So man and woman, husband and wife, are responsible to like they can't claim ownership of their own bodies. So he says the wife owns the husband owns the wife. So the two of them have to give of themselves to one another. Again, the gender distinctions are there.
I feel like the gender distinctions definitely are there, and I think this really supports like the same-sex attraction. A lot of the verses that we discussed before. But what if you had two people, and that I'm a born female but I identify as a male, and then my partner, it's the reverse, so born male but identify as a female. Couldn't arguably be like, Tim, I agree with you. That's why I'm the husband. And,
Mm,
like how
yeah.
do I'm aligning myself biblically here because I'm well suited within that male husband role and I'm abiding by that in God. Like, where does, I feel like those verses kind of like I said of like those roles at the beginning of like what we were made to do, like biblically, where is God pointing out, like, you don't get to question it. You don't
Yeah.
get to have that second guess. You don't get to decide something that I decided for you. Does God really put his finger on that?
In other words, is it morally permissible for us to like change our bodies and assume the role of the other gender?
As long
I think
as,
it's
the marriage is male and female, as long as one of us steps into the roles, technically it's biblical, right?
yeah. So do you remember do you remember in the homosexuality talk, we addressed the issue of just the sexual relationship, like men and men, women and women. There's no indication that a woman can become a man or a man become a woman. That would be patently obvious to the first century Christian to look at that and say, no, that's like you can't do that. But here's why: because they would have been aware of cults, religious cults in their day that were doing that too. But
Oh,
even more than that, well, not entering into like transgender type relationships, but cross dressing, doing transvestite type stuff,
oh,
castration, all that kind of stuff was taking place. But even
but
more
not.
than that,
Oh,
oh, go
sorry. Go
ahead.
ahead.
Yeah,
Uh,
they relate that back to the Old Testament law too. There's prescriptions in the Old Testament law that talk about uh, mutilating one's body and why that
that's a big
actually,
word.
yeah, that actually changed. The Israelites weren't supposed to do that for various reasons. Yeah,
Is there a
and specifically
difference?
mutilating their genitals.
Right. But is there a
Hmm.
difference between like that's torture? That was torture. That was not them being like, I don't identify with my genitals. I'm gonna change them. And we're calling it mutilation. Like, is that possible that like you're referencing like torture or something?
No, it's religious devotion is what's happening. Now,
Mm.
some people, if they're forcibly made eunuchs because they were captured by a conquering army or something like that, that's one thing. But well, let's get into it because I think there's good evidence to show what the prescriptions in the Old Testament are talking about are not just people who've been um, physically altered by coercion and violence. There's
There
something
there's
else
some
going on there.
consent there.
Yeah. Okay. So the main verses that come up in this debate are Deuteronomy 22:5 and then Deuteronomy 23:1. Deuteronomy 22:5 says that men and women should not wear the clothing of the other gender. Okay. That a man should not put on the clothing of a woman and the woman should not put on the clothing of a man. In other words, they should not appear as or disguise themselves as the other gender. And I apologize for like looking to the side. I'm looking at my notes as I talk to you.
That's
But
pretty out there. I mean, there it
yeah,
is.
yeah. So why would this why would they say that? Let me read a quote to you from Alan Branch, who wrote a book on this subject called "The Affirming God's Image," addressing the transgender question with science and scripture. So that's one of the books I'll recommend.
Oh, wow.
That's it. Yeah. So there's a quote here. He says, "A woman," he's summarizing, "a woman shall not wear a man's clothing." That's what the verse says. The word clothing there is Kelly, Kele or Keli, excuse me. That Hebrew word, Kelly, did not just refer to a man's outer garment, but also to vestments, utensils, tools, furnishings, etc. And what he's saying here is that, and it's not just clothing, but anything that would make a woman appear as a man. That's she should not do that. She should not basically fool anyone into thinking she is a man. And similarly, nor shall a man put on a woman's clothing, and the word there is simla, and that refers to specifically to the outer garment or mantle that a woman would wear. And this points that is the fact Branch point is saying that this points to the fact that neither sex should attempt to confuse people by appearing as the opposite sex. So cross dressing in that passage in that verse, it's called an abomination. So it's put in the same level as other sexual sins that are listed in that section in Leviticus.
Does it say why? Because that seems like, oh, I can't wear menswear or else I'm
Hmm.
like sinning.
Because
Or is it referring to something way bigger?
yeah, because cross dressing was associated with all the other types of sexual immorality, homosexuality, bestiality. Well, not necessarily like cross dressing would be like these, but all of these are listed together as forms of sexual immorality because you're changing the gender roles and you're doing this for sexual quasi sexual religious practices. Um,
Oh,
yeah. So in the very next chapter, Deuteronomy 23:1, it says that men with mutilated genitals were not permitted in places of worship. Now the grammar of that verse, we don't have time to parse it, but it speaks of men in two different ways. Men who have, it says basically they've been crushed, like their genitals have been crushed, and then men who have basically cut off their own. So it may be referred to some men who this has been done to, or that they've done it themselves. But the context seems to be related to uh, a cult prostitution in some way, because a few verses later it talks about temple prostitution, how men and women should not give their sons and daughters over to temple prostitution. So there seems to be in the context, again, context is what needs to guide our discussion here, and the context seems to be alluding to uh, ritualistic practices going on here. Now, what possibly could be going on?
yeah.
What
What is cultic prostitution or
Yeah,
temple
yeah.
prostitution?
So this is important to remember, that the Israelites, they're going into the land of Canaan, and they are told to live differently than the people of Canaan. Well, the people of Canaan have all kinds of religious practices, and there's a very prominent deity that comes from Babylon. Her name is Ishtar, and she's later brought into Canaanite religion. Her functions kind of change a little bit, but she's later identified with Asherah or Ashtaroth in the scriptures. So if you come across the word Asherah or Ashtaroth or Asherah pole, that is likely an allusion to Ishtar. Now Asherah, starting
Which
out,
is a Babylonian
yeah,
god.
yeah, some of the Hebrew scholars are going to like say, well, wait, like Asherah started out as something different, as the wife of a different god, but later on, Asherah and Ishtar are kind of conflated together in a lot of Canaanite
Wasn't
religions.
Jezebel like a leader in that cult? I thought I remember that
She
from.
erects Asherah poles
Oh,
at the high places around Israel, which is a common thing. Whenever idolatry would return to Israel, they would erect the high places and the Asherah poles.
got it.
So it's likely at that point they've probably mixed the worship of Asherah with the worship of Ishtar. Now, why is
Interesting.
Ishtar important? She is a Babylonian goddess, but she's known for her ability to change her genders, to go and change the gender of men and women back and forth. And her male devotees, which were called the Kagaru, they were known to castrate themselves and to make themselves quote unquote female. So they would sometimes castrate themselves and then assume the female role in sexual relations with people.
Willingly, with
Yeah,
consent.
yeah,
This
because they
was
were they were devotees of the cult.
God.
Yeah, yeah. So we have lots of evidence for this, both in Canaanite literature, Babylonian literature, that this was going on.
So when scripture's
Um,
referencing it, it's well aware of this happening.
yeah, that seems to be the context of why God is telling the Israelites, do not do this, because like when you are blurring the gender distinctions, you are acting like these idolaters. That is not how, basically it's not how I created you. I created you man and woman.
I see.
Yeah, so you're not to blur the gender distinctions. So that's the key texts that come to us from the Old Testament. Let me scroll
Really
down here through my
interesting.
notes. Yeah, so that seems to be the link in the Old Testament. When we get to the New Testament,
I
there's
was about to
also
say, what
some.
about the New Testament?
Yeah, well, I didn't even mention some of the other gender rolled passages, but one that's important is 1 Corinthians 11, and there's a lot of debate about all the different gender roles that Paul gets into in that passage. But essentially, if you want to boil it down to like a brass tacks, Paul is pointing to men act a certain way and women act a certain way in the church. And he doesn't just say because it's in the church. He relates it back to their natures. He's again, we don't have time to kind of exposit the whole chapter, but
Right.
he's addressing this problem of women not covering their head in church and why that's inappropriate. So there's a lot of cultural things going on here, but he is pointing to that he says there's natural things for men to do and natural things for women to do, and it's related to their natures. God creates man and then he creates woman, and that order is important because it reveals a little bit about our functions and how we relate to one another. Um, Yes, I know that's vague. There's again there. I don't want to get bogged down into the weeds of that chapter because there's like umpteen million different debates just on that chapter alone.
I was about to say, like, what do
Depending, it's
I? Oh
yeah,
my
it
gosh, I'm
depends
not
on.
ready to change my ways now.
Yeah, no. I don't think it's saying that women need to cover their head in church. I don't think
Oh,
that's an appropriate. I think that was a cultural thing that was going on. But the principles that derive from that are that essentially one principle that I think is from that chapter that's appropriate is that uh, well, for instance, with women, they should not present themselves in a way that would accentuate their sexuality. I think that's one of the principles that comes from that passage. Again, I don't want to get into it because it's like
right,
we'd have to get into like looking at each verse. But I think
right.
that's one of the principles that would come from
I,
that. Another one would be like Paul says, even nature teaches that it's a shame for a man to have long hair. Now it doesn't say that men having long hair is a sin, but he's pointing to there's something in nature that says men should not look like women because
I
it
see.
was the thing for like an honorable thing for women to grow their hair out,
Got
and
it.
there was sexual connotations with that. So
Got
for
it.
a man to do that, to grow his hair out and basically look like a woman, like he's like nature teaches you not to do that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I will defer to my New Testament scholars if you ever want to just dive a deep dive in 1 Corinthians 11. Just buckle up because there's a lot there. But
Okay.
the first century, when I said that Christians in the first century, it would have been obvious to them that of course you can't change, like you ought not to mutilate yourself. You ought not to what we might call, it's a bit of an anachronism to say sex transition, because someone who is in a cult like this devoting themselves, they're not really transitioning to the other gender, but they are embodying the other gender, let's say. So there's a couple of prominent cults, Greco-Roman cults in the first century that we know a whole lot more about than we do the cult of Ishtar, which we know a lot about the cult of Ishtar. These cults were the cult of Demeter, and then the cult of and if you look at it in English, it looks like Sybil, but in Greek it's Kubale, which I think is a lot cooler of a name. It's spelled Cybele. I'll just say Sybil because even though I like saying Kubale, it sounds kind of pretentious to always keep saying it, you know?
When you say cults, I guess I'm imagining like the modern day cults we watch documentaries on. Is there much difference there, or were they just religions that had sacrifices and God?
They weren't cults like we would think of today.
Oh, okay.
These were mystery cults. I'll often tell. Well, some of them
Mystery
were mystery
cults.
cults. Each god in the god or goddess in the Roman pantheon had it was called their own cult.
Oh,
It
this
wasn't
is
like we
like
would think. It
Greek
wasn't
mythology type
Yeah,
of
it wasn't like
stuff.
we would think of today of like, oh, like that group over there, they got their own prophet, they're a cult. This was more like a normal word to use, like, oh, it's the cult of Sybil, it's the cult of Demeter, it's the cult of Apollo. Like it's their group and the devotees and how they worship that god or god. There was the cult of the emperor
Got it. But you
as
wouldn't
well.
call like the Hebrews like the cult of Jesus.
No, they didn't really. Yeah, the Jews would say that they weren't true Jews, like they would call the Christians. They're not true Jews, you know, and they would actually use the Roman Empire. They would tell the Romans like, you can't trust these Christians, you need to kill them. That's what the first century Jews would often do.
So it's
Yeah.
very separate, just the way that those organizations functioned. Like one is functions like a cult, the other function as a group. What would you call
Well,
the Hebrews?
yeah, the Jews, the Romans made a lot of accommodations to the Jews when they took over Palestine. The Jews were like, we're monotheists, we're not worshiping any of your gods. Uh, and I'm a little fuzzy on why this happened, but the Romans basically made a lot of accommodations for the Jews. They were allowed to keep their temple worship, monotheism to Yahweh, and all that. When Christianity comes on the scene and says Jesus is the one true Lord, He's the one true God, this starts worrying the Jews. This is partly why Jesus is crucified, is because the Jews cook up. They go to Pilate and they're like, "Look, these Christians are saying that only Jesus is God, and they're not part of us. And if you don't take care of this guy, then we're going to say that you're not a friend of Caesar." And that was a really bad thing for Pilate because he didn't want to get chopped up by Caesar.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the Jews separated themselves from the Christians, and they said that the Christians were some wackos out there. So the Christians oftentimes were probably seen more as like an offshoot mystery cult, like
Okay.
so the mystery cults were a little bit different. We don't have time to get into those, but they were more secretive. It all revolved around secret knowledge that you had in this group that gave you certain access to the divine and all that stuff. But the Christians were kind of slandered as like a really wacko group that engaged in cannibalism and incest and all kinds of other things. That's like we see this in Greco-Roman literature, how they talked about Christians in the first 3 centuries. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so we're getting a little bit off base. The cult. So when I say cult, I don't mean like the Haley Bop Comet cult from the 90s or something like that. I mean, these are just like the devotees of certain religions within the Roman pantheon. So the cult of Demeter and the cult of Cybele, along with Attis. Attis is another god that's kind of associated with Cybele. These cults were known for what we might call like transgender like behavior. Let me just read to you this. So Cybele or Cybele, as she's called, she's brought in to the Roman pantheon, and she's called like the Great Mother, the Magna Mater, as they call her. And she's known for, like, her devotees are known for like gender bending type behavior because of her myth and the stories surrounding her. But the male devotees were called the Galli, Galli. It's a root of the word Gaelic, like the
Okay.
Gauls in Gaelic. Yeah, so she was really big up there too. But they lived in communities together, and they underwent self-castration. So they would go through this ritual, oftentimes public. So the first time they do this, like, the Romans are like all happy that they've brought in this new god or goddess because she's given them victory in battle. And the devotees are like walking down the street, and then just at sunset, they all castrate themselves. And the Romans are like, whoa, like, this is fine. You know that meme, the meme with the dog on fire, like, this is fine. Or the kid on the bus, like, I'm in danger, like that kind of stuff. But the Galli would, I think in memes sometimes, that's just what I do,
Okay.
So the
I'm in
Galli
danger.
they would castrate themselves, and then they would dress as women, and they would don heavy makeup at
And this
times.
was for worship purpose.
Yeah, well, it was, to show that they're devoting themselves. They're so devoted to Cybele that they would change their gender and present themselves as a woman.
Got it.
Yeah, so they would do that. Now we know that now first century Jewish writers talk about this. Philo and Josephus are two of the most well-known Jewish writers at the time, and they both describe this behavior, and they both talk about how it's inconsistent. Like, Jews do not do this, like good Jews do not do this, because it violates those laws that we just talked about in Leviticus. So I'm not even talking about Christian authors. Even the Jewish authors are pointing to this behavior, describing it as confusing the created order, that they're disrupting and destroying the created order that God has set up, and that Jews themselves should not do this.
I
Now,
see.
Christians consider themselves an offshoot of the Jews, and many of them are Jewish, and so they would also be aware of this type of behavior. It would be all around them, and they would know that men and women ought not to confuse their gender roles in that way.
So, just looking back from a 2024 perspective, it's historically known that this happens. This isn't just like a transgender movement of 2024 and the 21st century. This has been, going on in the past. And even in the past, it was not seen as an alignment with God. So it's not like we suddenly have this resurgence of a different type of identity. And now that people having their own valid personal experiences, we need to embrace it as if it was at the same level of just male and female. Even in the ancient Near East culture, when this was occurring, this was not seen as an alignment with God. So today in 2024, we should not see it as an alignment with God.
Yeah. Yeah, I would stop short of, and I don't think you're saying this, but I would stop short of anyone who would say that what's going on in the 21st century is just like what was happening in the first century, even though I think there are a lot of parallels and a lot of similarities.
Okay.
And there is in some circles of the LGBT movement, there is some, let's say, calling back to ancient paganism and these practices, that some of them are actually religious or quasi-religious in that sense, but not everyone that's involved in the movement today would be like that. But to the point, Christians would have known about that. Paul certainly would have known about this. I mean, he was a Jew trained just like Josephus and Philo. He would have known about this. He would have known about the law and all these cults. So when he's
Okay.
talking about gender roles and not to confuse them, he may not have had these cults specifically in mind, but the Christians would have known about them. It would have been surrounded by them.
Okay. So since we don't have the cults today and the cultic practices today, and it is very different, just being how it's shown in the past versus today. How would you, Tim, say, like, what's the relationship between the action in the past for these cultic purposes and then what's happening today at like pride festivals and transition and, non-binary? What's the
Well, I think what we said before about idolatry, that idolatry doesn't look the same, but there are similar um, aspects to it. So that no one is ushering out like a big statue of Sybil, let's say, or Ishtar, and saying, "Hey, this is who represents us now." But the idolatry of elevating my sexual expression as the end all be all in life, would be a form of idolatry. Instead of saying trying to reckon with how God has created men and women and their roles in society, trying to throw all of that off and redefine ourselves through moral relativism and naturalism, atheism, whatever, all the other things that come along with it, or even at times paganism. All of these things would be very similar forms of idolatry in that sense. So that's what I would. That's the link that
I see.
I would make.
I see. Gosh, I'm really struggling with this, Tim, just from a standpoint of like knowing all of this, knowing it's coming from a place of like lack of choosing God, for lack of better words. How do I now love my friends who are transgender? How do I love
Yeah,
them through this? How do I make them not feel like I'm forcing something on them? Because again, it's their choice. I have no place to judge. I literally don't have that power whatsoever. It's all on God. But like my job here is to love them. How do I love them through this? It's something I can't relate to. I don't understand, but I so clearly am like, I just want you in good graces with God. So what would be the best advice here?
yeah, yeah. Again, I want to be clear when I'm talking about idolatry and I'm sort of hard hitting on this stuff. I'm talking about the movement, like transgender ideology, because
Okay.
ideologies set themselves up as worldviews to explain and give meaning to our lives. But when we're talking about individuals who experience gender dysphoria, or perhaps they've gone through gender reassignment surgery and then they wake up, and they're like, I made a mistake. Or if not, maybe they're not there yet and they're experiencing gender dysphoria and they find their community among people who say, you know what, we want to affirm you in this and we want to help you transition. And they're getting all this advice and what might be akin to love bombing from a community like this. It can be very, very alluring to them. It can be very, very powerful. So I think as Christians, we need to understand that and not just stereotype everyone who is in that space and think that, oh, they're all radical political activists and they're all out to get me and all that stuff. Certainly, there's political fights going on. I'm not going to deny that. Um, but when you're dealing with individuals, we need to be very diplomatic, careful, and I think our attitude needs to be seasoned with mercy and grace. Um, I think if you were to look at a person, Jesus often when Jesus surrounds himself with social misfits, and he doesn't condone sin. Okay, when the woman caught in adultery is left by the Pharisees, and she's just there with Jesus. He looks at her and says, "Who condemns you?" And she's like, I don't know, no one. And he says, "Neither do I. But go and sin no more." So he's willing to associate with social outcasts, but also leading them to a place of holiness and repentance. And I think we need to do that too. We need to look at people with mercy. When Jesus when oftentimes he looks at crowds or he encounters a demoniac, a demon possessed person, and he says he looks at him and he has compassion on that person because he's God. He understands that person. He understands how they got there. And I think we need to, when we're dealing with individuals, we need to look at them and maybe just consider, how did this person get there? Not that we condone everything that they did, and not that we're saying that we need to now accept their lifestyle and call it good and all that stuff, but you're talking to an individual and you're going to drive them further away from the gospel if the first posture you take with them is hostility. I was listening to an interview recently of the daughter of Anton LaVey. Her name is Zena, or it was Zena LaVey. I don't know. I can't remember her name now after she got married. But she was the high priestess of the Church of Satan in California. And she was
Oh,
being interviewed by Jordan Peterson. This is years later. This interview is fairly recent. And she's a Buddhist now. She's no longer a Satanist. She left the Satanist church. She became a Buddhist. And I was listening to the interview, and I was like, that's interesting. I wonder if she's gonna say anything about why she became a Buddhist, or maybe why she didn't become a Christian. And she dropped this hint as she's talking. She remembers how when she was the high priestess, she was meant to go out there and basically be public relations for the Church of Satan. And she remembers very vividly Christian, Protestant, evangelical giving her death threats, trying to physically assault her, and other things like that. And she made this vow in her heart that I'm never going to be that. It's really sad.
Yeah, as a sadist, that's so...
Yeah. So I would say, with the transgender community, if some of them are considering, maybe they're not necessarily considering Christ just yet, but maybe the scales are starting to fall from their eyes, and they're like, you know what? Maybe this isn't what it was promised to be. The transgender ideology and the life of transitioning. I'm starting to have regrets. Are you the kind of person as a Christian who could actually sit down with them and persuade them to come to Christ? I think that's a good reflective question.
No, definitely not. I do not think I... Absolutely not. But I think the best I could... I don't want to say accepting, but like hold space for them. Love them.
Yeah.
Not make them feel like they're less than me, because who am I to judge? Like, I'm sure that I do things that they don't agree with. I'm a human.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an advice that I would give to people is that think about ways that you can give hope to someone. Because sometimes if they haven't transitioned yet, it's maybe a lot easier for them to like find hope and say, oh, okay, like I can go get help and maybe even like overcome gender dysphoria. Maybe some of them, it's not really gender dysphoria. It might be that they were confused as a young person, like a teenager, and they got mixed up with the wrong crowd, and now they're kind of waking up to that. So that's one side. But the people who have gone through surgeries and permanently altered themselves, those things are irreversible. And for someone like that, if they come out of that movement, they're going to have this realization that I can't really go back to the way it was beforehand. I can't have my body is forever changed. And that can have real effects on someone.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think for the Christian, we need to be able to give hope to that person. One, that life isn't the end all be all of life is not our sexual expression. So like if I think of this in terms of like a single person or a widow, or someone who's been just permanently marred in some way, and they're not able to have sex or be in a loving relationship and have that fulfillment, that's not the end all be all of life. And God can give us meaning and purpose and happiness in other ways. So that'd be one step in that direction.
What they have transitioned, and they don't regret. Do you think like it's the same thing? Give them hope that Jesus still loves?
Well, I think if someone really comes to Christ, or at least they really come to terms with what God is saying about gender, men and women, I think the light bulbs are going to come on in their head.
So again, like this is a conversation for those earnestly seeking God. This isn't a conversation to say we're right and everyone else is wrong because we believe in God. This really a closed circle of if you're trying to seek God and know him truly, these are principles that will fundamentally change you.
Yeah. I think if you're talking about those who, and there are people who go through the transition, they don't regret it. They have the inner feeling of happiness and they're surrounded by their community. That's certainly possible. I wouldn't say that's evidence of truth. But that's where we have to do apologetic, and we have to provide reasons. Maybe not that would convince them, but convince people that are listening to both of us. And we need to provide persuasive arguments for why the Christian worldview about gender is actually the one that makes the most sense and has the most explanatory power about human nature. But those who are earnestly seeking, I would say this, there's a lot of us theologians and ethicists are doing a lot of thinking about what the Bible says about eunuchs and how God loves eunuchs, and how, in the Old Testament, eunuchs were not allowed to go inside the temple because they were physically marred in that way. But in the New Testament, God uses a eunuch who knows I can't go to the temple. This is the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts. When Philip encounters him, this eunuch, he's called a God-fearer. He's not a Jew, but he He knows about the God of Israel, and he's a worshiper of the God of Israel. But he knows, I'm a eunuch. I know the law. I can't go into the temple ever. But
Wow.
when he meets Philip and he gets baptized, he's sent down to Ethiopia, and he is the one that carries the gospel to
Wow.
Africa. So God entrusts the spreading of the gospel to Africa to a eunuch.
Wow.
As I said in the other episode with you on homosexuality, there's good evidence that Daniel was likely a eunuch in
Yeah.
Babylon his whole life, and he served in the royal courts. And there's a really great verse, when there's an angel that comes to Daniel and delivers him a message. This is in Daniel 10. But when he shows up and Daniel gets scared, like you think of all people, like Daniel would not get scared of these things, but even Daniel gets scared. But the angel says to him, Daniel, you are greatly loved by God. This is a guy who doesn't have a family. He's never married, doesn't have kids that we know of. He lives away from his homeland the whole time.
Right.
He's in exile. And God says to him, you are greatly loved. Jesus says, some have been made eunuchs for the kingdom, and others have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom. And those who are able to receive it will receive it.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, Tim, on just the sexual identity isn't the end all be all, because yes, I mean, you could say that he was greatly loved because he was a eunuch, but he was also a fundamental person in the movement and representation of Jesus in a society that did not worship God. He was an advisory source to people on a council that he set himself apart, that did not adhere to, the Babylonian, just their overall rules. The sorcerers and the magicians, he played a different role in that represented Jesus and Christ. So I'm sure he was loved greatly by God for a lot of reasons, not just because he was a eunuch, but he did not let that overall define him or separate him from people who were and still worshiping God and had a wife and had.
Yeah, early on in the first part of Daniel, the famous verse in Daniel chapter 1, where he says, Daniel committed that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. And that kind
Yeah.
of sets up the whole book of the character
Yeah.
of Daniel and who he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, for him, as a good Jew, it was like the end all be all was to be a good Jew, and that meant get married and have kids and all the other things that you do as a good Jew. But he's not able to do any of those things, being in Babylon, living in exile.
Interesting. I
Yeah.
feel like I'm going to ask you a question. You won't have a very simple answer that I'm looking for, but
I will. Okay, I'll try to give a simple answer.
It's more so advice for those that are within Christ, are within the Word, trying to raise a family that is in alignment with the Word of God, but they have a child that's transgender, or they have a friend, or they have a brother. I don't assume that there's a simple solution here, but how do we encourage and give hope?
Well, I would say this first. Remember the experience of gender dysphoria. If that person is really experiencing that, the experience itself, I would not say is a sin, because it's something that actually there could be physiological things that are driving that, and we need to be sensitive to that. But maybe it's a teenager who's being very influenced by their friend group or school or something like that. I would say first of all, quickly talk to your pastor. Talk to a counselor or get a Christian counselor that you know. If not, there's the American Association of Christian Counselors, AACC. They have a website. You can go and get connected to a Christian counselor in that way.
Okay.
I'd say that's probably the immediate thing that I would do is connect with someone like that in your immediate space.
But if I'm not a Christian counselor and I want to support that person, I don't want to necessarily make them feel ashamed. I don't want to make them feel isolated. So I want to make them feel loved and known by God without condoning that I agree with what they're going through. Is it as simple as that? As just like loving with them and praying with them and encouraging their walk with them?
Well, when I mean like find a Christian counselor, what I don't mean is like just throw that person into counseling. What I mean is like just go talk to someone who can give you advice on how to conduct yourself and how to reach your loved one. If your loved one is experiencing gender dysphoria,
you're saying me, I go find a counselor, sending my child to that counselor.
No, go get advice from a counselor. Go get advice from a pastor who can because there's so many variables with situations like this. But your pastor or a counselor will be able to give you sound advice on what to do next.
Cool.
And you can kind of lay out, here's what's going on, and they can advise you.
Cool.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about my hypothetical child goes to counseling. Not me, but that's
Well,
good.
I do think eventually that would take place. But first, if you are not sure what to do with your child or a loved one, go get godly advice.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
I wasn't
Proverbs says,
expecting
in a
that.
multitude of counselors, there is a.
Wow. Nice answer. Nice and short.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Let's see those books that you've got for
Yeah. You
recommendation.
see me looking at the book. So
Yeah.
we'll wrap it up because there's probably people that are listening to this saying, hey, you didn't get into the science. You didn't get into all the different arguments against it and all this stuff. Because again, we were just talking about the Bible and the culture of the New Testament, Old Testament. So let me give you some books that you could do a deep dive into the subject if you want. And then a trick of the trade with scholarship is when you're reading one book and you see a lot of sources, go and buy those sources in the back of the book too. So
Ooh, goody morning.
yeah, lots of reading. So the first one I mentioned was Affirming God's Image by Alan Branch. It's called Addressing the Transgender Question with Science and Scripture. It's a really good synopsis of the whole debate.
Okay.
And it's not that big. You can see right there. So that's the first. Second one, another Christian book. This guy was my outside reader on my dissertation. His name is Andrew Walker.
Cool.
This is called God and the Transgender Debate. What does the Bible actually say about gender identity?
Wow.
So another like short book, and it's not very meaty. I mean, it's a good sound book, but it's not like heavy hitting. Like you got to know Greek and Hebrew and things like that to understand this book.
Cool.
The next book, and I think this is an amazing book. This one's called When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. And this is by Ryan T. Anderson. He is a Catholic philosopher at the Heritage Foundation.
Okay.
And this is the hard-hitting book on the movement. And he provides really, really good non-biblical arguments. So this is almost like public policy type book.
Interesting.
It's a really, really good book. And to make it more intriguing, it got banned from Amazon. So you can't get it on Amazon. You got to get it from somewhere else.
Why did it get banned?
I'm not even because the LGBTQ movement accused him of like misinformation and hate speech and bigoted and all this other stuff. It got banned in like 2019, I think.
Okay.
So he was on a lot of different conservative talk shows talking about it. But I've sat in classes not with this guy. He was lecturing my class. I mean, this is a sound book. It's sound research and sound argumentation. So it's really unfortunate that Amazon gave into the mob.
Interesting, because the other books were.
No, they're on Amazon. This is the prohibited book, so you got to get it.
Interesting. Do you think it was maybe prohibited because it wasn't saying like we're a Christian book? It was just saying like this is just.
I think that it was the debate was so ramped up at that time, and Amazon has now kind of backed away from like banning a lot of books.
It was just the thing to do.
I think if that book came out now, it probably wouldn't catch that much attention. But it was the book that was just taking a sledgehammer to the ideology. Yeah.
So go to good old bookstores, or is there like another website that you've used?
You can get it on Barnes & Noble, actually. Or you could probably get it from his website or find a way to order it. Yeah. Okay. And then the last book, I referenced this in the previous episode. This is The Bible in Homosexual Practice by Robert Gagnon. This is the foremost like scholarly book on the subject. He doesn't address transgenderism directly in this book, but it's a related topic when you're talking about New Testament and Old Testament backgrounds. So any of those books are going to be good.
Cool. Yeah, I'll put them all in the show notes if people want to buy them. I'll try to find all of the links.
Yeah. All right. Well, I hope I answered all of your questions sufficiently.
No, we have so much more to talk about.
No.
We have so much more to talk about. But I do think that you have painted, a very historical picture on it. And I think you point to a lot of verses as far as how it's referenced. But I don't think that this topic can be, discussed and wrapped up nicely in just 1 hour. I mean, at least I hope not.
No, it can't.
These are people's lives and identities. And this is also God. And, God is a never-ending pit that we can continually fall into, and understanding him and how it applies to our lives and how we can live ours just won't ever be simple. But I think you've done a really nice job at least laying some biblical groundwork and doing so with gentleness and respect. So I really hope that anybody that is tuning in understands that the purpose of this is to understand the biblical perspective, which you've done a great job. And this is a learning process of getting to know God and ourselves and how we can align ourselves and set ourselves apart. it's never going to be simple, which is why probably a lot of people don't talk about it. But I think that you've done a pretty good job, I think, scratching the surface. I think there's more to be said.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to always discuss these topics. Who knows? Maybe we'll talk about another controversial topic down the road.
Or a we could do something simple.
Yeah, we could actually. We could do something really simple.
Let's find a nice, easy topic about God and love and just stick with that. But no. And, putting yourself in line, because I hope it doesn't happen. And it hasn't happened with homosexuality, which I'm so glad. I think I was anticipating the hate. People have been receiving it and maybe keeping their comments to themselves. Thanks for putting yourself on the line.
Encouraging to...
It is. And, it's for you to be bold and courageous as far as like talking about something that could have potentially opened yourself up to a lot of hate. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay. Well, we'll find a nice topic soon. But other than that, have a great day.
All right.